Welcome to True Moment Stories, where the smallest moments can change everything. On a night when winter's breath cut through the city streets, she stood alone at a quiet bus stop, shivering, exhausted, and invisible to the world rushing past. Then, from the shadows, a man stepped forward. His coat was his only shield against the cold, yet without a second thought, he placed it around her shoulders. He didn't know who she was. He didn't care. But that single act, simple, human, and pure, would uncover a truth that would bind their fates in ways neither could foresee. Winter in the city had a way of making everything feel slower, quieter, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The night air was thick with the sharp bite of frost, the kind that clung to every breath and turned it into a cloud before it vanished. The street lamps cast pale circles of light onto the cracked pavement, their glow faint against the darkness stretching between them. Somewhere far off, a car engine hummed briefly before fading into silence again. Even the wind seemed to carry the sound of emptiness, weaving through alleyways and whispering against the glass windows of shuttered shops. On a corner far from the heart of downtown, a small bus stop stood like a forgotten shelter. Inside, a woman leaned against the side, her arms wrapped tightly around her body. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her boots tapping softly against the concrete in restless rhythm. Her coat was thin, the kind meant for brisk autumn evenings, not the punishing cold of midwinter. Every gust of wind found its way through the fabric, stealing what little warmth she had left. She glanced down at her watch, the dim yellow glow of the bus stop light catching on the silver band. 10:47. Her bus was already 17 minutes late. She let out a slow breath, her lips parting just enough for the air to escape in a visible puff. Her fingers were stiff inside her gloves. She considered pulling her phone from her bag to check the schedule, but her hands felt too cold to bother. She could already imagine the answer: delays. Always delays. Across the street, a shadow began to take shape. At first, it was just the faint outline of movement, a figure emerging from the dim stretch between street lamps. As it drew closer, the light revealed a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a dark wool coat that reached his knees. A scarf hung loosely around his neck, swaying slightly with each step. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, his head tilted forward as though trying to shield himself from the wind. His pace was steady but unhurried, each footstep crunching softly against the thin layer of frost on the sidewalk. The woman noticed him but quickly averted her eyes. She wasn't in the mood for small talk with strangers. Her focus remained on the empty street ahead, watching for the faint glow of approaching headlights. Yet when the man reached the bus stop, he paused. She could feel his gaze linger for a moment, not in the way that made her uneasy, but with a quiet, almost hesitant curiosity. The wind gusted again, and she shivered involuntarily. Without a word, the man shrugged off his coat. The movement caught her attention, and she turned just in time to see him step closer, holding the garment in both hands. "Here," he said softly, his voice calm but carrying enough warmth to cut through the cold. "You look freezing. Take this." Her eyes widened, caught off guard by the gesture. "Oh no, I can't. You'll be cold," she replied quickly, shaking her head. "I'll be fine," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm not going far. You need it more than I do." Before she could protest again, he placed the coat over her shoulders, his movements careful, almost deliberate. The fabric was heavy, thick, and still warm from his body. She inhaled without meaning to, catching the faint scent of cedar and something else she couldn't quite name. The heat spread across her back, sinking into her bones, easing the tension that had been building for the past half hour. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice low, almost lost to the wind. He met her eyes for the briefest moment. There was no trace of pity in his expression, only a simple sincerity, as though giving his coat to a stranger on a freezing night was the most natural thing in the world. The sound of an approaching bus began to grow in the distance, the deep rumble of its engine breaking the night's stillness. The man glanced over his shoulder toward the sound, then back at her. "That's mine," he said quietly. She nodded, still holding the coat tightly around her. He gave a small nod in return, an unspoken acknowledgement between them, before turning away and stepping toward the curb. The bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes, its doors folding open. He boarded without looking back, disappearing into the dimly lit interior. For a moment, she stood there, the coat draped over her like a shield, the fabric heavy with a warmth that felt strangely personal. She watched as the bus pulled away, its headlights fading into the distance until all that remained was the soft hum of the engine lingering in the air. Only then did she realize she hadn't asked his name. She didn't know where he lived, or why he'd been walking in this part of the city so late at night. She didn't know anything about him. But as she stood there with the weight of his coat on her shoulders, she felt something stir within her. A strange mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and an unfamiliar ache she couldn't quite explain. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed, was that she was not simply a woman on her way home. In the daylight, her presence commanded entire boardrooms. Her voice carried authority, her signature could alter the course of entire projects. She was the kind of person who was used to being noticed, to being respected, even feared. Yet tonight, stripped of all that, she had been invisible to everyone but him. The next bus didn't arrive for another 8 minutes, but she barely noticed the time passing. Her thoughts lingered on the man. The way his voice had sounded low and calm, the way his eyes had held hers without demanding anything in return, the way he had simply cared without expectation. In her world, kindness was often a currency, given only in exchange for something else. What he had offered her tonight had no strings attached. As she finally boarded her own bus, she slid into a seat near the back, the coat still wrapped around her. She pressed her cheek against the collar, letting the warmth linger just a little longer. Outside, the city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying a single moment at a quiet bus stop on a freezing winter night when a stranger had given her more than just his coat. The next morning began like any other, but the cold seemed sharper, the streets busier, and her thoughts heavier than usual. She sat in the back seat of a sleek black car, watching the city roll past in gray and silver hues. Her driver, Michael, kept his eyes on the road, glancing occasionally at the rearview mirror to see if she needed anything. She didn't. Her mind was elsewhere. Her fingers absent-mindedly brushed over the sleeve of the coat. His coat, still draped around her. She hadn't returned it. She hadn't even thought about giving it back when she got home last night. Something about the idea of letting it go felt wrong, almost as though she'd be erasing the one piece of human warmth she'd experienced in a long time. By the time the car pulled up in front of the tall glass tower where she worked, the world around her had shifted into its usual rhythm. Assistants waited in the lobby, greeting her with polite smiles. Colleagues glanced up from their phones, nodding respectfully. The elevator ride was silent except for the soft hum of machinery. Her office, perched high above the city, was warm and flooded with pale winter light. But even there, surrounded by the symbols of her success, the polished desk, the leather chair, the view that stretched for miles, she felt an emptiness she couldn't quite name. Her morning was consumed by back-to-back meetings. Strategies were discussed, numbers projected, deals negotiated. She played her role flawlessly, every word calculated, every gesture precise. But in the quiet moments, while others spoke, while papers shuffled, while pens clicked, her mind wandered back to the bus stop. The way his voice had sounded when he said, "You need it more than I do." The way he hadn't lingered to be thanked. The way he had simply left. By noon, she couldn't take it anymore. She called her assistant into the office. "I need you to do something unusual," she said, her tone low but firm. "Find out who was at the bus stop on Miller Street last night, around 10:45. Male, tall, dark coat, scarf. Paid for a bus ticket. Maybe with a card." The assistant blinked in surprise but didn't ask questions. "Of course, ma'am. It wasn't easy." The transport company was reluctant to release any information, citing privacy concerns. But power had its ways of opening doors. By the end of the day, she had a name. Daniel Hayes. She turned the name over in her mind, testing how it sounded. Daniel. It suited him somehow. There was a simplicity to it, a steadiness. She learned a little more. He worked at a small community center on the other side of the city, helping run after-school programs for kids.
No flashy salary.
No high-rise office. Just a modest paycheck and a modest life. The next evening, she found herself in a part of town she rarely visited. The buildings were older here, the streets narrower, the air filled with the smell of street food from small vendors on the corners. She spotted the community center easily enough. A brick building with large windows, through which she could see children gathered around tables, laughing and coloring. She hesitated before stepping inside. Daniel was there, talking to one of the volunteers, a warm smile lighting his face. He didn't notice her at first, too absorbed in whatever story the volunteer was telling. When his eyes finally met hers, there was a flicker of recognition but no surprise, as if he'd somehow expected her to come. "You found me," he said, his tone gentle, almost teasing. "You left your coat," she replied, holding it out to him. He didn't take it right away. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his gaze steady. "You didn't have to bring it back." "I wanted to," she said quietly. He took the coat then, folding it over his arm. "How do you even know where to find me?" She hesitated, telling him the truth, that she'd used her influence to track him down. Felt too much like admitting a power imbalance she didn't want between them. "I asked around," she said instead. Daniel didn't press further. Instead, he gestured toward the tables where the kids were working. "You want to stay a while? We're making cards for the nursing home down the street. They love getting them." It wasn't what she'd expected. She'd come prepared for a polite thank you, maybe a short conversation, and then she would leave. But something in his voice, that same unassuming warmth from the night before, made it impossible to say no. She found herself sitting at a table with a group of children, clumsy with the colored pencils they handed her, listening to their chatter. They asked her questions, told her stories, laughed easily. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been in a room like this, where nothing was about status or gain, where no one cared about her title. As the evening wound down and the children began to leave, Daniel walked her to the door. The cold outside was as sharp as the night they'd met, but somehow it felt different. Less empty. "Thanks for coming," he said. "Most people wouldn't bother." "I'm not most people," she replied, and there was a hint of a smile on her lips. He smiled back, and for a moment they just stood there, the silence between them comfortable. She wanted to say something else, something about how he'd made her see a part of herself she thought she'd lost. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she said, "I'll see you around, Daniel." And for the first time in a long while, she meant it. The days that followed seemed to move differently. For her, time usually came in sharp, measured intervals. Meetings, deadlines, appointments, but now there was an undercurrent, a quiet pull that kept bringing her thoughts back to Daniel. She didn't tell anyone about their encounters. Not her colleagues, not her friends, not even Michael, her driver, who had learned to notice when something weighed on her mind. This was hers alone. On Thursday evening, she found herself outside the community center again. She hadn't planned to be there. The thought had come to her during the final meeting of the day, and before she could talk herself out of it, she was already in the car, giving Michael an address she knew by heart now. This time, the building was quieter. The kids had gone home, and only a faint light glowed from one of the smaller rooms inside. She peeked through the doorway and saw Daniel at a table, surrounded by stacks of papers and a half-empty mug of coffee. He was writing something by hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're working late," she said softly from the doorway. He looked up, surprised, but then his expression softened into that familiar smile. "Some of the kids' families are struggling this month. I'm putting together a list of extra supplies we can give out. Winter hits hard for them." She stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the worn wooden floor. "And you're doing this all on your own?" "Not really. We get donations, but..." He shrugged. "I guess someone has to make sure it actually gets to the people who need it." She watched him for a moment, taking in the quiet determination in his posture. the way he seemed so at ease in this small, warm space that was nothing like the sleek glass towers of her own world. "Can I help?" she asked. His eyebrows lifted slightly, as though the idea had caught him off guard. "You want to?" "I do," she said simply. So he handed her a stack of papers, lists of names, notes about what each family needed. They worked side by side for the next hour, the sound of their pens scratching the only noise between them. Occasionally, he'd make a comment that made her laugh softly, and she'd catch him glancing at her with that easy, unspoken warmth she was beginning to crave. When they finished, he poured her a cup of coffee from the pot in the corner. It was lukewarm and slightly bitter, nothing like the imported blends she drank at the office, but she found she didn't mind. Somehow, in this place, even the coffee felt honest. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly, watching her over the rim of his cup. "What did you expect?" she asked, curious. "I don't know. Someone in a hurry. Someone who wouldn't stop to talk to a stranger at a bus stop. Someone who—" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Someone who wouldn't be sitting here on a Thursday night making lists for kids she's never met." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her coffee, tracing her finger along the rim of the mug. "I've been a lot of things, Daniel. Maybe I'm trying to be something different now." His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as though he was trying to read the parts of her she wasn't saying out loud. But he didn't push. When she finally stood to leave, the cold outside greeted her with a familiar bite. He walked her to the door, pulling his scarf tighter around his neck. "Same time next week?" he asked casually. She smiled. "Maybe sooner." That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying their conversations in her mind. The way he looked at her without expectation. The way his voice softened when he talked about the kids. The way he seemed completely unshaken by who she was, or perhaps because he didn't yet know. By the weekend, she decided she didn't want to wait. She went back on Saturday afternoon, bringing with her 3 large bags of winter coats, scarves, and gloves she'd had delivered from one of the city's high-end stores. The woman at the reception desk stared in surprise when she explained why she was there. Daniel was in the gym, helping a few of the older kids set up for a basketball game. When he saw her, his eyes widened slightly, then flicked to the bags she carried. "What's all this?" he asked, walking toward her. "Extras," she said simply. "For the families you mentioned." He looked from her to the bags, then back again. "You didn't have to." "I know," she interrupted, her tone soft but firm. "I wanted to." For a moment he just stood there, as if weighing her words. Then he took one of the bags from her hand and smiled. "You're full of surprises." The kids ran over to see what she'd brought, their excitement filling the gym with noise and laughter. She found herself smiling more than she had in months, watching their faces light up as they tried on new scarves or pulled on warm gloves. Later, when most of the kids had gone, Daniel leaned against the wall beside her. "You fit in here more than you think," he said quietly. She glanced at him, a hint of a question in her eyes. "This place isn't about what you have," he continued. "It's about what you give." For a long moment, they just stood there in the quiet corner of the gym, the sound of the last few kids playing echoing in the background. Something in the air between them had shifted, not dramatically, but enough for her to feel it in the way her chest tightened when he smiled. When she left that day, the winter air felt different again. It still bit at her cheeks and made her breath cloud in the air, but now there was something else lingering. A sense that, slowly, something was beginning to change inside her. And she knew, without fully understanding why, that she would see him again very soon. It happened on a Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the wind cut straight through you, and the city lights blurred in the distance through a fine mist of cold rain. She had just wrapped up a late meeting when she got a call from Daniel. His voice on the other end was different. Not the easy warmth she'd grown used to, but something heavier. "Are you busy?" he asked. "Not anymore," she replied. There was a pause. "Could you come by the center?" "Not about the kids. I think we should talk." The words hung in the air, laced with something unspoken. Her chest tightened, I'll be there in 20 minutes. When she arrived, the community center was nearly empty. The lights in the main hall were dimmed, and Daniel was sitting alone at one of the tables, his coat still on, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he didn't seem to be drinking. He looked up when she walked in, but didn't smile. "I found out who you are," he said, his voice quiet but steady. She froze. "One of the parents mentioned seeing you on TV," he continued. "Said you're the CEO of Larksun Industries. I didn't believe them at first. I told them they must be mistaken. But then I looked it up." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "Why didn't you tell me?" His question wasn't accusatory, just tired, almost wounded. "Because," she took a slow breath, "because I didn't want this to change. I didn't want you to look at me and see a title. I didn't want to be treated like I was different." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching hers. "I don't care about your title, but I care that you didn't trust me enough to be honest." His words stung more than she expected. "I've spent years in a world where trust is complicated," she said softly. "Every person I meet either wants something from me or thinks I'm someone I'm not. That night at the bus stop, you didn't ask for anything. You didn't even wait to be thanked. You just gave. And for once, I didn't want to ruin that." For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he set down his mug and rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm them. "You know what's funny? When I first met you, I thought, here's someone who could use a little more kindness in her life. I didn't realize how much you'd give back." Her chest loosened just enough for her to breathe again. "Daniel, I don't know how to do this, whatever this is. But I do know that I don't want it to end." He studied her face for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, his expression softened. "I believe you." Relief washed over her so strongly she almost laughed. But instead she just smiled. A small, genuine smile she rarely allowed herself in her other life. He stood then, pulling his coat tighter around him. "Come on. I'm walking you home." She frowned. "It's freezing out there." "Good thing I have a coat," he said, and there was a flicker of his usual teasing in his voice. They stepped out into the cold together. The rain had turned into light snow, the flakes catching in the glow of the streetlights. As they walked, they didn't say much. Words felt unnecessary. His presence beside her was enough. Steady, unhurried, quietly reassuring. When they reached her building, she hesitated at the entrance. "You know," she said, "I still have the scarf from that night." He smiled. "Then I guess I'll have to let you keep it. Consider it a reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That sometimes people surprise you, and sometimes you surprise yourself." For a moment, they just stood there, the snow settling silently on their coats. Then he reached out, gently brushing a stray flake from her hair. The gesture was simple, but it warmed her more than the heated lobby waiting behind her ever could. She wanted to say something more, something about how he'd reminded her of a life beyond boardrooms and contracts, how he'd shown her that kindness could be quiet yet life-changing. But instead, she just said, "Good night, Daniel." "Good night," he replied, and with that, he turned and walked away into the softly falling snow. She stood there for a long time, watching him disappear down the street, until the city swallowed him from view. And for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what tomorrow's meetings would bring, or what deal was waiting to be signed. She was thinking about the way a simple act of kindness, offered at a bus stop on a freezing night, had changed everything.